Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and try and encourage you to examine yours. So this week I'm going to be playing the first of three parts of a discussion I had with Robert Rowe, who's a Christian apologist who lives in Australia, runs the YouTube channel Sentinel Apologetics. We discussed theistic evolution, some types of interpretation, and Noah's flood. That's the way I wanted the discussion to primarily go. Although it was a long discussion, so we won't actually get into Noah's flood very much for this first part. That'll come more in the second part. So that's what I'll be playing for you this week. But before I get into that, there's another thing I wanted to do here that's something that's been coming out in the news. Maybe try and start a new segment here called something like Philosophy in the News or something. Again, if you think of a better title for that segment, let me know. I thought about trying to do this as a Facepalm and Sigh award, but it doesn't really work on this. So anyhow, why this is important is it demonstrates how terms, ideas, and theories and stuff shift over time, and we need to be clear and precise in what we're talking about. So in the last election, as everybody, well, if you pay attention to the news, you well know, Virginia is basically now being run by the Democrats. After about 25 years, I think they had a divided government for a while, a Republican majority for a while, and now they've got essentially a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor. Well, as part of what the Democrats are now doing there, they passed the Equal Rights Amendment in Virginia, and this makes Virginia the 38th state to do so. Now, the Equal Rights Amendment is something that was first proposed back in the 1920s that essentially says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, and then I think there's some language in there that, like, Congress can pass appropriate laws to enforce this and so on and so forth. If I'm remembering my history correctly, it was proposed kind of in light of the success the women's suffragette movement had, where they got women the right to vote, and they were trying to build off of that, but it didn't really go anywhere in the 1920s. Well, in the 1970s, it got picked up again, Congress passed it, and I think it was like 34 or 35 states ratified it. Well, you need 38 states to ratify a constitutional amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. Well, in subsequent years since then, a few more states have ratified it, and now Virginia becomes the 38th state to do so, which means, in theory at least, it should now become a constitutional amendment. Now, there's some legal hiccups on this because some of the states that originally ratified it subsequently withdrew their ratification, and Congress put a deadline on the ratification of 1982, which is clearly long since passed. So this will probably all wind up in the courts anyway, with the courts trying to dictate, well, how does it work? Is there a time limit on constitutional amendments? Can Congress put a time limit on them? How does it work when states ratified it and then turned around and withdrew their ratification, and so on and so forth, things like that. But that's not the point here. The point is, you need to read exactly what the 1923 constitutional amendment said. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And that, more or less, is what I would call first wave or classical feminism says, which is women are people too, and treat them like it. And that's, you find a few exceptions and there's some more nuance, but that's basically all the first wave and classical feminism said. Women are people too. Now, since that time, as I've alluded to before, I think on the podcast a couple of times, you've had second and third wave feminism, which say radically different things. And so since that time, you've actually had a lot of feminists in essentially trying to game the system in favor of women because they are claiming, well, women have been disenfranchised so long they need a leg up. That's why you have things like various state governments and the federal government trying to do grants and other things like that to get women into STEM fields. That's why you have laws that will specifically protect women but not men, and so on and so forth. And so the trouble with this is, let's suppose the courts decide that this constitutional amendment can be passed. You're suddenly going to turn around and find that a lot of these laws are now illegal. For example, selective service and potentially the draft only applies to men. Well, that's not equality of rights under the law if that's the case. So if this Equal Rights Amendment gets passed, women should have to register for selective service and potentially a draft later thereon, because that's equality. Conversely, let's say that one of the state legislatures passes like a grant or a scholarship or something like that that funds it for a woman who wants to go to a STEM field at a state college or something like that. Things like that happen all the time. They're pretty common. Well, all it's going to take for that to not be equality under the law is for a man to apply for that grant, even though it specifically says it's for a woman, have a man apply for it and be denied because he's a man. Suddenly it's not equality under the law. And so what I think this very well illustrates here is a vast, vast difference between classical or first-wave feminism, which again just said women are people too, treat us like that, and second and third-wave feminism, which is a very, very different thing. It often will say women need to be advantaged over men. Some aspects of it say that women are actually better than men, and so on and so forth. And so the reason I think this is important to talk about is you'll often hear in political discussions relating to things like feminism and women's rights, advocates will slip between these different types of things. If you attempt to argue against some of what they're doing, saying, hey, it's unfair and unjust, it's not equal protection of the law, if you give a grant that's specifically for women and don't have at least something comparable for men, well, they'll then slide back to that first definition of feminism, classical feminism, and say, well, how can you not be for equality? How can you not be in favor of women having rights? And then if you, like I am, then they'll slide back into this second and third wave feminism definition, and you'll often see people who are activists equivocating between the two definitions. And so that's why I bring this up, is because that needs to be called out. Classical or first wave feminism, for the most part, it's probably a pretty good thing. I'm inclined to think that women probably shouldn't have to register for selective service and potentially a draft, because I think men and women are different. But as a general rule of thumb, saying, hey, the government shouldn't treat you differently because you're a woman than a man, yeah, that's probably a good idea. It gets a little messy with something like selective service, but yeah, that's a very good idea. But then take second and third wave feminism, and there's some parts of it that are reasonable and good, and some parts of it that are really, really stupid and flat out wrong, where you've got a bunch of self-described feminists who protest against films that say, hey, men have problems in society too, like they protested against a recent film a few years ago called The Red Pill, or they'll protest against it when a town will open a men's shelter where men who've had domestic problems can go and live and stuff. And it's not like the state was doing the men's one in expense of the women's one. They were just trying to do a men's one in addition to. And so that's why I bring this up, it seemed to me, as I said, so illustrative of the vast, vast difference between what feminism is in the minds of the average person and what it is to the political activist who's out screaming, at least most of the political activists who are out screaming and protesting. Vastly, vastly different. First wave classical feminism, pretty good idea, pretty sensible. Second and third wave feminism, not so much. And don't let people equivocate between the two. They're vastly different ideas, and just because they share a name doesn't mean they're the same thing. And so that's what this illustrates very, very well. And I don't know, part of me kind of hopes that this Equal Rights Amendment does actually get ratified and made part of the Constitution, because then we're going to see a lot of these laws that are designed specifically to do nothing but help women in certain things being challenged, and we're going to be forced to question, well, is this really feminism? Is it really equal? Do we really want things to be equal? And maybe we'll actually, I don't know, get into more of the meat of some of these issues, rather than it just being stupid, surface-level political nonsense like it always is. And yeah, I know that's not likely to happen, but call me hopeful for once. So with that out of the way, I'll now go ahead and play the first part of Robert and I's discussion on theistic evolution and a little bit getting into the flood.
All right, greetings everyone. This is Rob from Sentinel Apologetics with Phil Karlberg. He's the organizer of Examine Life with Phil. He runs the podcast. That's what it's called, Examine Life with Phil. And I actually approached him because he had some interviews with some good friends of mine, Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones, which, by the way, I did not realize until after I saw him interview a young creationist.
Yeah.
And it's because of that then I approached him, and I was like, hey, you've interviewed other people that I know. So, and then, yeah, we just had some back and forth discussions and let him know where I come from, what I do, and the Sentinel website and all that. And yeah, he was intrigued with the work, especially with respect to Noah's flood and the creationism. And so he's actually here to interview me. And I thought, why not just approach it in a fruitful way where I'm live streaming it on my channel, and he's also going to put it onto his podcast. And so definitely check out his podcast. It's quite explanatory in its scope, and a lot of interesting guests on there. And so yeah, Examine Life with Phil, and he's going to be asking me questions, and I'll be responding back to him. And I pray that this will be a fruitful discussion.
Yeah, I really hope.
Introduce yourself to the audience, and then we can get started.
Okay, yeah. As Rob said, I'm Phil Kahlberg. I run a podcast called The Examine Life with Phil. As far as I know, you can find it on all the major podcast services. If you find one it's not on, contact me and let me know, and I'll try to get to work on that. I basically try to apply philosophy to pretty much all aspects of life, whether they're religion, theology, politics, even day-to-day life. But since I'm a Christian who happens to be a philosopher, I also wind up doing quite a bit of things in the relation to apologetics, because I actually think Christianity is true and want to argue for that, which is how I come to talk to people like Rob and Michael Jones and other people who are Christian apologists. So I got into doing this when a professor from my school, where I got my master's degree, asked me to start the podcast. And I can give you a whole long story about how I got into philosophy. That's actually the first episode of my podcast, is the whole long story, which takes like an hour, but I won't spend an hour. The gist of it is I was in the Army way back in the Second Iraq War, and toward the end of that, I started having what I now know but didn't call then an existential crisis, where I was starting to ask all the big questions of, well, does God really care about me? Why is it that I seem to be suffering when I'm doing the right things, and so on and so forth? Because I had never been in a position where I had to deal with that kind of stuff before, even though I was raised by good Christian parents in a good Christian home. And in trying to figure all that stuff out, pursuing answers, I got into even greater love of stories than I'd had before. I started reading all these books and identifying with all these characters and stories who were grappling with the same issues I was. And that led me to then go on to college after I got out of the military and get a bachelor's degree in English, because I loved good stories. I still love good stories. There's few things more pleasurable for me than sitting through a good movie that's a well-constructed, organized story that has something meaningful to say. So anyhow, toward the end of my time getting my bachelor's degree there, we started getting into postmodern literary criticism and deconstruction, these kind of ideas that say that there is no authorial intention in the text, that it's all meaning is up for grabs, and various things along those lines. And that really pushed me away from that, because here we'd be in like our senior English seminar class, and we'd be reading an essay saying there is no meaning in the text because there is no authorial intention. And I'd say to the fellow students and the professor, how can this be? This guy wrote this essay with an intention to say something to us. How can he then turn around and say there is no authorial intention? This literally makes no sense and is self-contradictory. And so I didn't go on and pursue more education in English like I originally planned to, because I started realizing, if I go into graduate work in English, this is what I'm going to be doing, and this is stupid. So why do that? And about the same time, I started coming across Christian philosophers like J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig, who were exceptionally good at what they're doing. Though I don't recall exactly what it was, but there was one time where, J.P. Moreland was giving a talk on how you could rationally believe Christianity without appealing to faith in the sense of being irrational and things like that, where he just went through and laid, here's why you can trust what the gospel say. Here's the evidence that where they match up. Here's the evidence that Christ rose from the dead. Here's why that's not contradictory. Here's why it doesn't contradict science. And I was like, well, this is astonishing. I need to look more into this stuff. And I eventually wound up getting a master's degree from Holy Apostles College and Seminary in philosophy. That's a Catholic seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut, in the East Coast there. And, full circle, about 4 or 5 months ago, I actually managed to interview J.P. Moreland on my podcast in one of his recent books. He was a wonderful guest to have. Unfortunately, I could only talk to him for about 30 minutes, but it was great that he even could spare me 30 minutes, because he's a famous and prominent enough philosopher that he doesn't even have to talk to anybody he doesn't want to. And he agreed to talk with me for a little while. So that was wonderful. So that's what I'm trying to do here on my podcast, and by doing philosophy, is pursue, as it says, an examined life to help us all live better lives that are more consistent with the truth, whether that's, in theological and religious things like what Rob and I are going to talk about, or even in simple everyday things. Like I did a podcast one time where I talked about systems thinking, and how when you talk to a philosopher like me, we tend to think of things in a linear sense, where it's an argument like, well, if A, then B, A, so B. But when you look in the real world, it doesn't always work like that. In fact, it's usually much more complicated. It's usually more like A is a system that affects B, B is a system that affects C, and C is a system that in turn also affects A. And you've got to figure this whole thing out. It's complicated. And so I like to do my podcast a little bit more, as I said, more generally than just Christian apologetics. But because I'm a Christian philosopher, I end up talking about that stuff quite a bit, because it is very important. Questions like what Rob and I are going to talk about, like whether or not people evolved or the world was created 6,000 years ago. And consequently, since we're going to try and focus on the flood, whether or not Noah's flood actually happened, and if it did, whether it was a worldwide thing like the last guest I had on the podcast, Scarlett, claimed, or whether it was a local thing like I know Rob claims, and many other people like I haven't heard him talk about this specifically, but I'm pretty sure that's what Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy thinks, and I know that's like what Hugh Ross and many others think. So, yeah. Is that a long enough introduction?
Oh, that's great. Yeah. It's sort of like, it feels like we've known each other for a while, even though we're just
cool.
just getting to converse.
Yeah. And I know I guess I should mention for people who will be listening to my podcast later, you actually live in Perth, Australia, right, Rob? I got that right? So it's about 2:30 here for me now in the afternoon, but it's 4:30 in the morning for you. So you are willing to either get up so early or stay up so late to talk to me, and I really appreciate that.
That's okay. Yeah.
Because I know I don't function very well at 4 o'clock in the morning, but you're doing just fine.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Rob, for people who are tuning in, obviously people who listen on your channel know exactly who you are, but for people who are going to listen to this on my podcast, can you tell me and us a bit about yourself, what it is you do, and why you're running a apologetics channel on YouTube?
Yeah, so I guess I'll give a little bit of a testimony. So I was born in India in '88, and I come from a family that is a mix of Christianity per se, like Catholic, Protestant. A family that has had a lot more experiential sort of experiences with the supernatural from India, more so than, say, an intellectual application of the text. I guess the particular individual that was the catalyst into me thinking carefully about the Christian faith was actually my opa. So you may notice, what's a Dutch word for grandfather? How is that coming to play? So my family being European sort of descendant, that's why I was born there, because of World War II, when the family migrated there. And so, it basically, we had to migrate kind of like Sound of Music style. Oh. We had to run away from Muslim persecution. Oh. Not just Christians, but also Hindus were being persecuted. And I was about 9 years old. So in '97, we just flew over. And the one thing I do remember from that is that from a completely entrenched environment of animism and like what I know now to be very weird, spooky paganism, to a complete sterile environment that is Australia. There's no cows on the road, there's no festivals, there's no loud music and drums, and it's just bland. It's like a ghost town, and but very modern. It's like a Blade Runner-ish type of environment, but like as if nothing's on the road. That's sort of like I'm being thrown into this modern environment. Going, what the heck? But and it's because of that sterile environment that because when my mom introduced Jesus to me back in India, I remember when I was 5, she introduced Jesus. She was like, "I would like to introduce you to Jesus," and I'm like, who is this Jesus? Where is he? And why should I care? Like, I was thinking these things even back then. But I guess, in a way, I'm thankful for the way I've been brought up in regards to the religion, that it wasn't forced onto me. I wasn't like, I hate to say this, but indoctrinated. That is sort of like a very sensitive term. I don't want to caveat people that, there are Christians that have been brought up with the faith since childhood, but I guess I'm sensitive to the ex-Christians that are usually the young of creation. It's like apologia. They come from a very staunch sort of Christian background, and then they just lose the faith. And so I can't help but sort of see indoctrination in that context. But so in that sense, I'm thankful I wasn't in that category, although my family do come from a very formal, conservative, sort of old-fashioned upbringing, I guess. So coming into Australia, my folks did not maintain a type of like, do this or else, like or you're in big trouble if you don't believe, or like they just sort of just allowed me just to be me. But at the same time, to bring up, like what Proverbs says, to bring up a child in the right way, sort of thing. So they did sort of do that at least. And so in the church, I did go to church, but I didn't believe it. And then I was wrestling with the culture, because the culture was, again, that sterile nature, very secular, very worldly. I was right in that all through high school. And then finally, when I was approaching my pretty much my 20s, so when I was 20, my Opa, so he passed away in 2010, and in 2009, he pretty much started treating me like, oh, you know what, the day is going to come, you're going to place your hand on my cold forehead, and in the casket, and you'll be, as a young man, you'll be asking questions like, well, why is this possible, and how, like death is actually a reality, and because he knew I was sort of like a deep thinker like that. So and we had discussions back and forth, and with respect to the Bible and holy books and scriptures, and he would talk about war stories and the miracles that would happen in the war and all that stuff. And so I guess I had a sort of like a similar Hugh Ross type experience. Hugh Ross, in his testimony, like he starts to read Genesis 1. I sort of had that same sort of thing where I was intrigued with it just read like a history book rather than, say, a book of ethics, like do this or don't do that. Because in the Hindu Vedas, being brought up in India, it's very much that esoteric type of literature. And so, that's what intrigued me. But again, I just wasn't interested. It was only after his death, and sure enough, when I did place my hand on his forehead, that then, like in your field, the deep philosophical questions started to just emerge out of nowhere. What's the meaning to life? Why is there death? Is there a solution to death? And that's been my walk ever since. It's been about 10 years. And so leading into the academic side of things, so with university, I guess about 2-3 years into my walk as an interested individual in Christianity that knew that there's truth behind this, but I didn't have like a heart sort of conviction to follow Jesus. Finally, it was when I read in Matthew 11 when Jesus says, "Take my yoke, and your burdens I'll give you rest with respect to your burdens." it was because of that I read that so many times, but then finally it just clicked, and finally I just, the whole give your life to Jesus sort of thing. And so,
very cool.
Yeah, ever since then, I decided to just go, okay, I know I've read through the scriptures here and there and in quite a bit of in-depth study, but now I want to look at it very critically again. Like I want to, and now that has been a very slow process. I haven't finished it, but that's when I started to discover scholars like Hugh Ross and Michael Heiser, which is an ancient Near Eastern scholar, and John Walton, the Biologos team and the Reasons to Believe team. And then that's when I started to come across the Young Earth Creationist crowd. And then I was just like, oh, wow, okay. Now there's all these groups. Then it's like layers of an onion. Then you start to notice, well, there's so many denominations. And then that made sense to me, like dad being Roman Catholic, mom not being Roman Catholic. And then it's like you're going back to the drawing board again. Now, now what do you do? Because here I'm sort of this lone wolf, looking at this holy text and sort of seeing what academia is saying. But notice academia is sort of, it's like as if they have horse blinders on. It's like as if they don't know that these other things exist. They just, these studies are very specialized, like a peer review paper is only for that topic. Mm-hmm. So then again, this is why it took a long time. So now 10 years into the walk, I'm very comfortable now where I sit, although I know there's a lot to learn and there's still a lot of questions I have with respect to the text. And sure enough, I'm being patient, not only in my own research, but also waiting on God's providence for, say, some other gifted, person he may unlock, another question that I had that I may not have the answers to, but he or she may do that. So it's sort of like a waiting game, but at the same time, it's fun. It's exciting, and it's just like in science, especially in science where we ask the same type of questions. We go to the lab and work on it, and my views have changed. But in the minor differences, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I guess you could say I was because my family, being European heritage, they come from a Shakespearean type, vocabulary, and so I really like the King James translation. Now, it wasn't the King James only, but again, that was one of those when I came across the convictions of someone like Ken Hovind, which I really respected. I very nearly easily was able to fall into that trap of, fighting for the King James because it's such a majestic translation, and because I was completely ignorant of the textual criticism and the arguments in that context. You see, so it's very easy to fall into those traps, in my opinion. If you have a conviction. I'm currently a theistic evolutionist. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing about my position is I do believe in a literal Adam and Eve, but I don't believe that they were the first humans. And I believe that humanity arose about 200,000 years ago in Northeast Africa. They've migrated into the Persian Gulf about 70,000 years ago. And then about 13,000 years ago, you have Noah's flood. And so basically the Persian Gulf that we know today didn't exist at the time. Mm-hmm. So the question that a lot of geophysicists ask is, this is an unnatural formation, and where did this Persian Gulf come from? And sure enough, it was a rapid flooding during the end of the Pleistocene and the advent of the Holocene. And so if the Garden of Eden is located at the head of the Persian Gulf, and sure enough, the Armenian mountain range and the fauna and the flora that's described in that flood narrative like the olive leaf, for example, if it's all within that region, and also the 4 rivers of Eden, then I think we've solved the problem as to where was Noah located and where the flood was located. And that's pretty much where I'm at the moment.
That's a very... I'm intrigued by this theory of a regional flood. I think I first heard Hugh Ross mention it a long time ago, and I was actually talking to my wife about this a little bit earlier today, how you and I were going to talk about this, and I said, it does seem to me that if you're not a young Earth creationist, you almost have to go with some type of a regional flood for Noah, or just say it didn't happen. I don't really see how, if you're a theistic evolutionist or an old Earth creationist, you really have another option there. You have to say it's regional or it just didn't happen. And there's obvious reasons why, if you're trying to take the Bible seriously, you don't want to turn around and say, well, it didn't happen. So
right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, sure we'll get more into that, because that's the whole point of what we're talking about. But so did you start the apologetics channel you do here now because of it, how you came to just be exploring these deeper questions about philosophy and theology and apologetics, and decide, hey, why don't I do this channel at the same time as I'm working my way through these things? Or
the channel originally started where I would, I guess, what's the term where you sort of hoard a lot of books, like say like a bookworm will hoard his whole shelf will just be full of books. So for me,
just off camera, I've got a really big shelf full of them. They're stacked in multiple ways. So I know what you're talking about.
So for me, it's because I don't have the room for that, and because I guess I'm a little bit tech savvy. So for me, it's in fact, it's become a joke amongst my viewers. It's called the Google Drive. There's terabytes of data that I save, and go check out Rob's Google Drive. It's got whatever you need. So
you have to pay for it if you got terabytes. Like I use it, but it's capped at 15 gigabytes because I don't pay for it.
Exactly. Yeah. So with 2 terabytes, I'm paying about 100 something a month.
Wow.
Just to keep that. I mean, and I'm doing that out of my own pocket, just that it's there for people to use. I mean, I have the storage on my computer, but then I feel convicted that it's not shared. And so but I do have it securely locked. So that's why I ask people to request access, so that I know, okay, this person is legitimate and all that stuff. So
that way you can make sure nobody's hacking in, deleting your stuff or something like that. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And plus I'm also concerned about the copyright, that I do care about copyright. So I don't want to. Basically, I don't want people who have worked hard on this material to just be misused in that sense as well.
Oh yeah, I get that. I don't have near the amount you do, but I like to store videos and lectures and stuff just when I come across good ones. And there's many of them where I think, this could benefit a lot of people, and if I would put it up on YouTube or something, but I don't have the copyright for it. It's somebody else's. So I don't really want to turn around and do that, especially if it's something I had to pay for or something like that. Yeah.
So that I would sort of hoard all this material. That's the thing. I don't have a Foxtel subscription, or I don't have even a Netflix. Well, now it's Netflix. Like I don't even have Netflix. I don't watch TV. I mean, I'm not that socially awkward, but I do watch movies and but most of my computer's full of just academic literature, videos, and all that. So then what I was doing was, like, while I was doing school, I would simultaneously go, what, that would be an interesting clip to put on there and just store on the YouTube. So my original name was actually General Han Solo. That's originally my
that's pretty cool.
My YouTube name started like that, and so then my internet sort of presence was actually on Paltalk, and so it was that. In fact, that was my sort of from around 2012 onwards. That was my my first sort of experience in actually communicating these ideas to people online. I didn't have a quote-unquote community to communicate these ideas with, except, say, the local church, which then again, even they weren't interested in the deep stuff that I was getting to. And and the funny thing in the Pal Talk context is that in the religion section, you have the various religions, but it's so. I mean, I hate to say this, but it's like hippie.
Oh,
it's very
anything goes.
It's just like, oh, it's just all about love and don't worry about this and that. And so where I usually hung out in the Pal Talk section was actually the social issues section, which is full of politics and the current trends. So at the time, it was Obama and as president, and so and interestingly, a lot of Muslims was hanging around in that section, and so this is where my first sort of engagement with Muslims started, and Islam, and then it's like iron sharpening iron. How do I defend, say, the Trinity to these people? And so again, it's going back to the drawing board. Like it's like, yeah, I've been building up, and then back again. You go back to square one because now you're again engaging people, and so then Google introduced the Google Hangouts in 2015, and so that's when because Pal Talk just died when that happened, and so then that's when I decided to hang out with a lot of atheists, and so one of the first atheist Google Hangout groups that I joined was what's called the Great Debate Community, and it's run by Steve McRae, and that was my next venture into sort of this type of format, like live streaming on YouTube, and then that's when I changed the name from General Han Solo to Sentinel Apologetics around, I think it was 2017-ish, like mid 2017, late 2017.
Okay.
And in the meantime, I started to, in my own personal life, I was running my own Bible study groups. I was writing my own little like commentaries, I guess. Like I started to feel comfortable enough to do that sort of thing. And so then I decided to just start making original content. Like, yes, I've put all the content that's helped me and what I consider to be academically orientated and established for the sake of, people watching. But I thought, you know what? I think it'll be good that I start making my own content, which is now what I've started to do. And I mean, I still haven't stopped in sharing the odd, say like a Huros clip that hasn't been aired before or something. But yeah, that's pretty much what I'm doing at the moment. And my friend Hunter Bailey, so I actually met him through the atheist community group, and him and I actually he's a seminary student. He's just finished. He's about to get into a master's in Biola, and I just took him under my wing. I was like, look, why don't you and I just team up? And so we become really good friends like that. And so we write blogs together. There's a centralapologetics.org blog. We just engage the community. And the thing is, we engage it with salt and light and with love. We don't, we sort of shy away, unapologetically we shy away from the unnecessary drama that just for the sake of it, that's just caused. And so, that's great. Pretty much the history of the channel. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. What you're saying there at the end reminds me of a quote from one of my favorite philosophers, Edith Stein, have you heard of her before? No. Oh, she's not as famous as she should be. She was a...
the name does sound familiar, yeah.
She was a Jewish woman in like the 30s and 40s in Germany who actually studied under Husserl and was like a contemporary of Heidegger and one of the phenomenologists. Well, she more or less thought her way into becoming a Christian and a Catholic and wound up being a nun, and kind of tried to mix Aquinian Thomistic thought with phenomenology. And she's really, really a very, very good philosopher, in my opinion, far, far better than the other phenomenologists, because you can actually read her and understand it without poring over it for hours and hours like you have to do with people like Heidegger. It's not that she isn't deep, she is, but she actually writes in a way that's accessible, which is very, very rare in philosophers, unfortunately. Well, she has a wonderful quote where she says, don't accept anything as truth that doesn't
like come from love or also have love. And I try to remind myself and people of that all the time, because that's just so true, that what you're saying, it seems far too often when you get into debates and discussions, even among fellow Christians, that people just get so heated and forget that we need to approach these things in love, which is, I know you contacted me after I had Scarlett on to talk about young earth creationism. And even though I do think she was wrong, and that was one thing I appreciated in what she said, is she was polite, she was charitable, and we were able to attempt to have a reasonable discussion without us screaming at each other that you're not taking the Bible seriously or some hateful things like that. So she was willing to engage in good faith.
Yeah. No, the thing is, I'm guilty for sort of losing my patience, and I haven't just done that in say the younger creationist context, but I've come across Muslims that's frustrated me. I've come across many other denominational contexts, but again, I think it's basically God's leading, that sort of like a training ground to sort of become better, and over time, when you look back at those discussions, you sort of cringe that you even lost your shirt over that. So
yeah, I can think of many times I've done that too. But I agree with you. I think that's one of the reasons why. This is kind of a side note. I think that's one of the reasons why God doesn't specifically spell everything out in Scripture and in other places like it's a technical manual, is because there's a great value that comes in having these types of discussions and disagreements, where it is, like you said, iron sharpening iron, and it makes us better people and better followers of Christ when we do this the right way. And if God literally just laid it out in Scripture and said, nah, this is exactly the way it is, here it is down to the most nth technical analytic level, and nobody's going to be able to disagree about it, well, then we wouldn't be able to have these types of discussions, and we wouldn't have that chance for growth.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, this is something I ask of almost everybody, because I think it's a fun question to ask. But what is a very odd or unusual philosophical or theological view you hold? Something that you're pretty well convinced of, but that you think like the average person who does what you do would look at you and go, "You think that? Come on."
I was thinking of how should I answer this question? Because I was thinking of quite a few, but probably since this discussion is mostly honing in on a creation evolution sort of scenario, I think I'll put it this way. I'm under the conviction at the moment that you need evolution to understand what's going on the cross.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah.
You need the theory of evolution goes hand in hand, like an Ace Ventura quote, like a glove. It fits like a glove, where the theology of the hypostatic union of the Logos with the flesh, with the body, that evolution as a hypothesis, as a philosophy, I guess, as well, and obviously as a science, fits right in line with what's going on the cross, atonement-wise, and what the early church called theosis, so deification, glorification, that sort of thing. How is theosis possible between the Logos hypostatically sort of linked? And that's another thing, how do you explain hypostasis? It's such a difficult word to define on that it's like a connection, but no connection at the same time, sort of thing. So I can get more into that if you want, but that's pretty much.
I know that's not what we came to talk about, but you've intrigued me. I'd like to hear a little more about that, if you don't mind. How do you I don't necessarily although other people would disagree, I don't necessarily see any conflict, or at least inherent prima facie conflict between the two. But you're saying something much, much stronger, that they just go together so perfectly. And I have not heard that before. So
you need evolution, the philosophy and theory and the science of evolution, to help. And that sounds like, are you serious? Help? Because that's a serious word. To help the theology. So I'm a huge fan of the patristic writings, especially when I was this local study group where I write the studies. So far I've been through Ephesians. Now we're going through Revelation at the moment, and that's in fact equipped me to just be a better reader of the Bible, not just of just reading the Bible, but also the scholarship, the commentaries I read. And I got initially it was hard to do. It was sort of boring to do, but then it motivated me to stick at it, and that is the mode to read ancient Christian commentaries. Like, what did Hippolytus say? What did Origen say? What did Augustine say?
Yeah.
And now that I have software, like the Logos software, that's a huge benefit for the church, in my opinion, where you could sort of hyperlink Greek words with the English translations, especially between the patristic writings and, say, the Septuagint text, which is what they were using. You could, a question came to mind was, hang on a second, what did the church fathers say about the hypostatic union? And just a throwaway little question like that, and then I'll take the lemma of hypostasis, and or hypostasis is the pronunciation in Greek, and I'll take that and just do a word search. Where does that word appear in all through the ante-Nicene and post-Nicene Father literature? And then the amazing thing is that you come across church fathers, and I have the quotes in the studies, that connected with creation, that Jesus is hypostatically connected to, so he became flesh. They quote John 1:14. In order for the creation to then experience glorification. Now, this is just, I guess you could say, their most cutting-edge perspective was that they would be thinking of glorification language that you see in Paul's letters, and connecting it to this thing that happened in history, and that is the Logos becoming flesh. In my mind, now as a 21st century sort of thinker, I'm thinking to myself, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense if it's evolution, because according to our understanding of the universe, you have a prime mover, which caused the Big Bang. Now, this then comes back to the whole, like, is it a domino effect, meaning he set the laws into motion at just the right fine-tuning? And obviously that's an argument given by even cosmologists like Lawrence Krauss. He doesn't hold to a god per se, but he does say the dark energy is 10 to the 120th power fine-tuning. So the periodic table of elements has to form after a lot of birthing and dying of stars, and sure enough, it starts with hydrogen, and then sure enough, over time, 9 billion years later, you have all the ingredients for the solar system that you and I exist in to start to form, and then 3.8 billion years later, through evolution, you have you and I existing as a species. And that process is interconnected over time. And then this comes to the whole, are you an A theorist of time, B theorist of time, that sort of thing. And then when Jesus comes in history to die past, present, and future, well, he's incarnating and hypostatically joining his divine nature with the universe, because his body is stardust. And if you think about it, his body is technically connected to the cosmos because of this vast interconnection that it's like there's history, there's billions of years of history in all of our bodies right now.
Oh yeah.
And so another cutting edge perspective is that in the early church they had this thing known as a principle of plenitude. So basically, if God is such a magnificent creator, are there other life forms in the universe? And because you have the Greco-Roman religion that looked at the wandering stars like Jupiter, and they would say, oh, that's Zeus or something. And so that discussion continued on, basically saying, no, that's impossible, because then that would mean the Logos has to become incarnate every time on all these other worlds, and we'll have to save ET that way. But then you have other church fathers like Origen saying, actually, no. And he very beautifully and remarkably speaks about what he calls fatherly creaturing. That's but that sounds like a bit odd in English, but that's the word he used. Speaking about the fact that he's quoting from Ephesians 3 verse 10, where Paul says that there are families plural in the heavens and families plural on the earth. And this is weird because in Second Temple literature you have this depiction of other beings, let's just say angels, but in a physical, tangible sense, procreating on other worlds. And somehow, and this is in the Book of Enoch literature, where Enoch visiting the other worlds, and so Paul is like in line with that, and you have the church fathers in line with that. And so the question is, how is that possible? And so then you have the church fathers that say, no, it's this one moment in history. So Colossians 1, you read the patristic writers on their reading of Colossians 1, where verse 15 onwards, you have Jesus being the creator of all things, visible, invisible, this and that, this and that. And then notice verse 20. So God, through his Son, is able to reconcile things in the heavens, things on earth, all culminating on the cross. And so then so obviously that's the theology speaking, but I'm thinking like a scientist, like what's the mechanics behind this? What's the operators? How is this actually working out? And sure enough, I'm thinking, yeah, God just has to enter the system, which is this universe. He just has to incarnate into one body, which happens to be a human species, that in itself is billions of years connected to the rest of the cosmos through evolution. And that one act, from a hyperdimensional context as well, because if he's God, he's transcending the 10 dimensions of our universe, which, by the way, I can get into other things on that. But the point is he can just affect the whole cosmos. And then now you have Romans 8, where the creation can experience the first fruits of those who are in Jesus. So if you're a younger creationist and you don't hold to evolution, so younger creationists are kind of like a genie in a bottle sort of thing, like a genie in a bottle that pop, this thing is created out of, like ex nihilo, like bang, like Adam and Eve are just created, or this particular kind of species is created. So there's no history, there's no interconnection. So the universe is not fluid to anything else. It's just its own ontological existence. So then when I'm reading Romans 8 or I'm reading Colossians 1, how are those things also affected by the cross? Because by that logic, it's only the humans that are affected, because they are the only ontologically self-existent thing that popped into creation or into being in your model. But if the human race has this interconnectedness with the rest of the cosmos, then it makes perfect sense for the cosmos to also be affected by what Jesus did. So,
So if I'm following you correctly, what you're saying is, if you take a more young Earth creationist model, which essentially does say God spontaneously created all these things ex nihilo, that not just the universe, not just the Big Bang, not just the world, but like each individual species and so on and so forth. And I know some of them will parse it out a little differently and say, like, God didn't create poodles and Great Danes. He created one pair of dogs and things like that. Right. But more or less everything.
But the one pair of dog, how did that come about? Did it just pop?
But that's more or less what they say, is that then you don't have that ontological, or maybe we would want to say metaphysical, connection between everything that's alive, because it all just kind of came into existence through the Word of God. But it's not like there was, as you're saying, this long process of creating all the matter and all the types of molecules, et cetera, necessary in stars, and then forming the planets that eventually formed us, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So since Scripture does say that all of creation has been and is being redeemed by Christ's death, then it's easier to explain that if there is this connection. Did I more or less understand you right? Yeah. Okay, yeah.
You have Genesis saying, "Let the earth bring forth," and I'll just throw this in there. Verse 20 is a very fascinating verse. In fact, look at the last 2,000 years of Genesis commentaries on verse 20 of Genesis 1. So in the Septuagint, it says, "Let the waters bring forth birds." Now, I can go to the Talmud literature. So there's Talmudic Jewish commentary on this, as well as the patristic writers. And I'll give you one. So Saint Basil, either Basil or Basil, how you pronounce it, Basil the Great. He goes. So he quotes the verse in the Septuagint, and then he goes, "How can the waters bring forth birds?" And then he goes into this hypothesis that, well, what's in the waters? Fish. Oh, what's in the air? Birds. Oh, and in fact, at the time, they since they were atomists, so they had the concept of the atom. They actually understood that air is like invisible atoms flowing around, and so they had the concept of fluid dynamics. Believe it or not, like they were quite sophisticated in their thinking. So they thought of air as like a fluid, like a medium. And so they use descriptions of how a fish swims in the water. Well, air is just a less dense version of water. So the birds swim in the air. So then Basil is going, oh, fish have wings and birds have wings. And here's the spooky part. He used this term. They are of one family. They have a common, I'm quoting verbatim, they have a common derivation and they are of one family. And here I'm looking at this going, this is in the 3rd, 4th century AD, and he's already using term like, in evolutionist speak, monophyletic pedigree would be the description of this type of cladistics. Back then they didn't have those terms, and so he's just saying, I wonder if birds have a family relationship with fish, because the text is saying that the birds come from the waters, from the oceans. Now you fast forward to the 1500s, read John Calvin's commentary on verse 20, because Luther, Calvin, they all noticed this, and Calvin specifically goes, there are atheists, and I'm sort of paraphrasing what he says here, but there are atheist men in my day laughing at this because it's nonsensical that birds come from the oceans. So notice, evolution wasn't around at the time. And so then he's like, but I leave it up to God's wisdom and for God to be vindicated in the future that this is the way he did it. I just have to accept it by faith. Now, fast forward to the 1800s, and then you have church historians like Philip Schaff, who was one of the guys who did the translations of the patristic writings. So Philip Schaff was famous for the history of the Christian church, and he is he added all the footnotes in the patristic translations. So when he comes across Basil's quote, Philip Schaff suddenly just goes, "Oh my gosh, this is what Darwin was talking about. That you have this progression from fish to dinosaur to bird." Fish, reptile, bird. And so it's interesting to see how you have this sort of interpretation that this is what the text says. We can't explain it from a scientific perspective. Let's just be patient about it, all the way for the next 1900 years, only until Darwin comes on the scene. Then it's okay, because now science has demonstrated that that's the case. Now, this is something that I find it curious that the evolutionists will not sort of pick up on. They don't, not the evolutionists, the young creationists will not pick up on that. They don't, I don't know why, but the text clearly says, let the earth bring forth.
Yes, it does.
It's this natural cycle of things taking place. And if there's any King James onlyists in the crowd, the King James actually makes it very explicit that the birds come from the oceans. A lot of the other translations, like the NIV and all that, it sort of cushions the translation purely because they're using the Masoretic text. But if you're looking at the Septuagint, the Greek is very precise like that, which the King James translators was also using. The Second Temple literature text, I'll end it with this one. Like the Book of Enoch, for example, says it. So there's like a paraphrase of the days, and it says on the fifth day, the waters will generate feathered birds. So here you have Jews in the Second Temple period actually adding words, things like feathered birds. So it's not just a bird as in, what if it's a flying fish or something, like just a flying creature? No, they're being very specific that the species in the oceans bring forth these feathered birds. And go to the next chapter, Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. God creates Adam from the dust of the ground. The word yetzah there, which is very unusual because there's two yods. It's the only time it occurs, actually. It's sort of like a misspelling. There's two yods in that word. Yetzah is only meant to have one yod. And so this then went, in rabbinic tradition, they went into this tangent. It's sort of conjectural, like, does the two yods mean there's a good inclination and an evil inclination in man? But regardless, that word, when you do a word study throughout the Old Testament, it appears in passages like in Psalm 139, speaking about the formation of an embryo. So when God forms me in the womb, is the forming an instant, or does it take 9 months of evolution that we understand it, and then you have a human being born? So if the forming over time is the word that's used in Genesis 2, verse 7, then the dust of the ground over time becomes a living soul, becomes man. And sure enough, from a concordance point of view, which is sort of like a Huros sort of perspective that I hold to, that fits right in line with the scientific understanding of human evolution. In my opinion, the derogative terminology from the Young Earth creation is the molecules to man, which it's sort of like tongue in cheek, because I think to myself, but you were once molecules, before you were conceived, and then you became a man or a woman afterwards. But yeah, all
of us were, in a certain sense at least, once molecules. And if I'm remembering this correctly, because I've done some reading and research into philosophy of mind, your body actually changes all the molecules changes all of them out about every 7 years or so, where you're just, as far as matter is concerned, not even the same thing that you were 7 years ago.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's, I don't think that necessarily follows that there's a big problem there, but it's interesting. So, anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a wealth. And did you just do that all off the top of your head? That's impressive. It's like I'd have to have a bunch
like I said, I just sort of wing it.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so I know you'd said that you describe yourself as a theistic evolutionist, and would you subscribe to the concordance model that Hugh Ross takes? Do you modify it a little bit? How would you parse out your view? Because I know there's lots of different ways that people say they're theistic evolutionists. Like I've even heard of some who basically buy into neo-Darwinism wholesale, in the sense that they don't even think God's any way involved in it, but then still turn around and call themselves theistic evolutionists. And I'm kind of like, well, that doesn't really quite work if you're going to go that far. And I don't know, you don't take that view, but could you describe a little bit more as to how you would describe it?
I'll use very briefly. I'll use eschatology as an analogy here, where so a scholar like Michael Heiser, he gets frustrated with eschatology purely because all the systems cheat. There's holes in all the systems, but yet at the same time, there's valid arguments in all the systems. Mm-hmm. So now what are you left to, now what? And the solution is all the systems, let's see if you can synthesize all the systems. Mm-hmm. And so why not try and synthesize what we see in the book of nature and also the book of scripture? Mm. And so So concorders like Hugh Ross, I think, God bless him, he is focused and he's brilliant in what he does, with especially the science sort of scenario. But when it comes to the scriptures, he's not sensitive to the scholarship of the ancient Near East, for example. Mm-hmm. So I'm very sensitive to, say, a John Walton-like argumentation of Genesis 1, temple inauguration text. It's an ancient Near Eastern, read it as an ancient Near Eastern text. So, for example, if a flat earther approached me with, the earth is flat due to the Genesis passage, I'll be like, great, sure, I agree, because that's what the text says at the time.
Because they didn't know any better.
Exactly. But then, so this is, so I would argue this to someone like Hugh Ross. I'd be like, Hugh, I'm a concordist just like you. But let's first realize that the Bible wasn't written to us. It was written to them. It was written for us, obviously through God's providence. You have this sensus plenior is the Latin. It's like this slow unveiling of information over time. Like the deeper hidden meaning of the text is sort of slowly unveiled over time. And you see this in prophecy. For example, Isaiah 53 is not about Jesus. It's about Zerubbabel. Psalm 22, it's not about Jesus. Like, take any of the Messianic prophecies, so-called Messianic prophecies. You won't find a dying and rising Messiah in any of the Old Testament passages. And yet, the New Testament authors concord those passages with Jesus. Because, and don't forget, Ephesians 2 and 3. What does Paul say? In past times, this was unknown to people. But now it's being revealed to the prophets and teachers and apostles. And it was a secret that God kept, from ages past, but now is being unveiled. So if there's, and when Jesus has to open the minds of his disciples to understand the scriptures, so there's something embedded in the text that God, in his wisdom, was sort of, this will only appear at the right time, so to speak, this type of understanding when required.
Mm-hmm.
So why can't we do that with the creation text? Because as I've already shown, the last 2,000 years, you see this consistent pattern of question, but the right question every time. And then bang, when Darwin comes on the scene, okay, makes sense now. Great.
Okay. Yeah, I get what you're saying there. Another example of what you're talking about there is I brought this up in discussions about inerrancy. Example I like to point to is Matthew 2:15 quotes Hosea 11 in reference to Christ saying, "Out of Egypt I've called my son." We'll go back and read Hosea 11. It's not messianic. It's God in a dialogue talking about his relationship with Israel and how he's bringing them out of Egypt. And ironically, I bring this up with the point to say Matthew was writing with a different sense of how you do writing in history than we are, and this is evidence of it. Because if I did that today, you tell me you're taking that out of context. You can't do that. But wasn't a problem for Matthew, so we need to try and understand why that's not a problem for him. And ironically, the only real pushback I've ever heard is kind of exactly what you're saying, where people who are saying, it's fine, are saying, well, that's because Matthew can concord like that. He can read back in Hosea and realize, this is God doing this big grand thing that Hosea couldn't see then. So even though Hosea didn't intend it in that way, it's perfectly okay for Matthew to take it that way, which I'm kind of sympathetic to that, like you're saying. I just find it ironic that a lot of people who would say that, then as you're getting at, aren't willing to turn around and then do that with Genesis as well, where it's like you're picking and choosing your hermeneutic there, where if it's okay for Matthew to do that, then why isn't it okay for us to do that in regards to Genesis? You need to have a consistent standard.
Yeah, exactly.
And obviously, all of us make mistakes, and we're all guilty of not applying our standards consistently, but we should at least try to and acknowledge it when, you're right, I wasn't being consistent there. So,
and again, in the whole the whole inerrancy context, like another thing that dawned on me in a very remarkable but simple way, if you think about it, take something like John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All right, great. Now, you do come across the type of Christians that hold to sola scriptura that see inspiration as being very mechanical. So it's like dictation, like the Greek words have to be written exactly like that.
Yeah.
But I started to realize, hang on a second, John could have written that first verse in a many different variety of ways to mean the same thing. It doesn't have to only be that. And for example, that's the beauty of the gospel is that if you translate John 1:1 into, say, the Chinese translation, very beautifully, the Chinese word for logos is the word Tao. Now,
Tao or Tao?
Oh, sorry, Tao.
Tao.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think they pronounce it Tao, so I'm sort of You may have to check me on that, but
I don't know Chinese pronunciations.
It's the yin yang symbol, where you have in their religion this grand concept of the Tao, that polemically as a Christian you're going, that's the logos, that's the word, and because that's the only word in the Chinese to even describe this word from the Greek.
That's cool.
It's just amazing. Like, and naturally, obviously, the Chinese rendition will be vastly different to, say, the English rendition, and vastly different to, say, the Spanish translation or something. But notice that the gospel has explanatory power to affect all cultures with all different varieties of languages in all their contexts. And yeah, it's just amazing. So is God limited to an ancient Near Eastern audience? And the answer is no.
All right, that's where I'm stopping Rob and I's discussion for this week. Next week, we'll get a little bit more into the actual flood. That's, again, what I wanted to focus on, but we were just having such a good conversation that it took us a while to get there. So, as always, write in, let me know what you think. You can reach me for any kind of comment or question at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or find the Facebook page, just type The Examined Life with Phil, look it up, and send me a message there, leave me a comment or something there. What did you think about Rob's story, or his idea that evolution makes better sense of the atonement than young Earth creationism? Personally, I wasn't quite convinced by that, but it is an interesting point that's probably worth considering. So yeah, write in, let me know what you think, and as always, if you like the podcast, like what I'm doing, please share it on your social media, or give it a like here, or rating on whatever podcast app you use. And yes, if you really, really have to, I won't even get offended if you share it on Twitter, even though Twitter is probably the worst of all possible worlds and should always be avoided. But hey, maybe introducing my podcast to the worst of all possible worlds will make it a little better, so it won't be the worst of all possible worlds anymore. I hope so anyway. So I'll be back again next week, and that next week it'll be Rob and I getting into discussing the actual theory and evidence that indicates that Noah's flood may have been a regional flood in the area of what's now Iraq, Iran, the Persian Gulf, etc. So thanks, and I'll be back next week.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.